Hey, we got a call about a male hitting a female and the two of them getting in this vehicle and taking off.
So you
want to tell me about those scratches on your face?
She had a cell phone in her hand. That's why I was pushing her away.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Should the Moab cops involved in the Moab incident, where Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie were confronted, should they be placed on probation? Now, the irony is that the report found that the mistake, the unintentional mistake, really came from the fact that officers failed to cite Gabby, right? And that feels like a very unfortunate result based on where things are right now. If anything, you sort of feel like they should have cited Brian. And so how can that be the error? How can the error be their failure to cite Gabby? But there certainly were mistakes. One of them was that a statement was never obtained from the original 911 call. And right at the beginning of this clip, I've sort of summarized everything in two sound bites. The one is Officer Pratt saying to Brian, "We heard a 911 caller saying that you slapped her." So there's already something that he's heard and seems to know, right? And then doesn't seem to act on later on. And then you have the other officer, Officer Robbins, checking Brian for injuries, but not doing the same with Gabby. And we're going to go into that in more detail. You know, why didn't he take photos of Gabby? What did he do with the photos of Brian? But before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So that clearly is a serious mistake that was made. They kind of got more corroboration from the 911 call, but they didn't really get corroboration on the other caller. And I do think in this area, you can kind of understand why things happened. First of all, there were two 911 callers, two different people, two different witnesses, right? And then you also had four officers on the scene, at least two of them police officers. And one thing that becomes quite clear, I've done, and I'm continuing to do an analysis of the Moab incident. We're already at episode 5. I'll be doing a deep dive number 6 sometime soon. But you kind of have a situation where you have two officers speaking to these two individuals at separate times. And you can actually see how there's some confusion about who is taking the lead. You know, you have the one officer present first, but then you have the other officer coming onto the scene and then both talking to the suspects at different times. Well, who's actually in charge? Who actually knows, who kind of knows the most and knows where to take the information that they have? And one thing that I don't think happened enough was Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins standing aside and consulting with one another based on what they know, right? Based on what had been reported and based on what Gabby and Brian had said to them. There needed to be more of that. And instead you kind of had the one officer sort of standing alongside while the other officer is talking. And I think the outcome may have been very different if you had one officer speaking to Gabby and then Brian and then Gabby and then Brian, just one officer. And the fact that you had two, I think, added to this level of confusion. So I think one thing that law enforcement can take out of this is you need to have one person tasked with continuity, the kind of like the lead detective, the person who should be the primary resource for asking questions, answering questions, giving information, and who ultimately makes the decision. It shouldn't be kind of a partnership. Someone needs to take the lead. And in the Moab incident, I think the best officer for that was Officer Robbins, who was driving behind Brian and saw him swerve the way that he did. He needed to really take charge and get a balanced view of everything. Have a look at Brian's injuries, but also have a look at Gabby's. Get Brian's statement, but also get Gabby's. Get the statement from the 911 caller, but also get the other statement from the other caller. And you will notice when you study the deep dive that he is trying to be systematic about it, but things start becoming more and more chaotic when you've got 2, 3 other officers on the scene. and he's sort of standing by, half listening to what the one officer is saying while he's on his radio. So in other words, the sense of who is primarily in charge gets distorted, and it's important that that doesn't happen. And so according to fact number 6 from this report, the investigative review, it's a very long review, I think it's almost 100 pages, but there's this one section where the officer references a 911 call that identified Brian Laundrie pushing Gabby away from him, and then says there's a second witness who they haven't spoken with yet but may corroborate this claim. The 911 call of the second witness in fact claims Brian Laundrie slapped Gabby Petito. Should the officer have obtained this statement from the second witness or listened to the 911 call before determining who was the primary aggressor? And so the response was there was only one 911 call in reference to this incident. That caller reported Brian slapping Gabby. I think that's really the bottom line. The person who called 911 reported Brian slapping Gabby. The other witness was found on scene at the Moonflower and provided a verbal and written statement later on. Okay, so there weren't two 911 calls, but there certainly were two witnesses. He goes on to say, this issue is addressed in more detail later on in the report, but in short, the answer would be yes. The officers should have obtained a statement from the 911 caller before making a final determination, if it was possible for them to do so. So what they're kind of saying there is, at the end of their speaking to Brian and Gabby, they probably should have called this person and gotten a full written statement from him. And in a way, you did have Officer Pratt call the one witness, but that was before he'd actually been provided with all the information. So you had a lot of things that were almost right, but just not quite. Point number 7, the officers twisted themselves into knots trying to find a way to avoid effecting an arrest or citation because of their sympathy for this couple and their assessment that no one was actually in danger, which is precisely what the legislature attempted to curtail, substituting the judgment of the officers for the mandates of the legislation. The response of the officer to this was, I believe it is clear from the body-worn camera footage that stating the officers twisted themselves into knots trying to find ways to avoid effecting an arrest is a gross mischaracterization of what actually happened. Law enforcement is being second-guessed now more than ever, which has led to officers taking more caution and time as allowed. So it's quite an interesting aspect there. And this is Officer Robbins' response. He says, I would say the officers displayed sympathy and empathy for this couple, which undoubtedly led to Officer Pratt second-guessing himself, despite the fact he said multiple times what needed to happen. Officer Pratt resorted to calling a supervisor and then rereading the assault statute. From there, the statute is not fully read, and what was read was misinterpreted. And I think, given what was supposed to happen, that Gabby was supposed to be cited, I think the officer really took pity on her, felt sorry for her. She really looked fragile. She was already emotional. And, if he was going to arrest her, it was going to make things 100 times worse. I also think Gabby and Brian didn't want the roller coaster ride to end. They wanted to continue their van life adventure. And the officers were also kind of sympathetic to that. As far as I'm aware, if you don't arrest someone for domestic assault, you can't separate them. I do think what happened during the Moab incident was unfortunate, but you can imagine if Gabby was arrested for being the aggressor, if she appeared in court, perhaps she would have revealed what Brian had been doing to her. Maybe not, on the other hand. In my opinion, looking strictly at the events of the incident, I don't think the cops deserve probation. However, I do think the cop, Officer Robbins, that failed to upload his photos of Brian's injuries and failed to document photos of Gabby's injuries should be kind of given a warning. Then there's also an interesting tweet from Michael Ruiz from Fox News. He said, an investigator asked Officer Robbins what happened to photos. Why didn't you take any pictures of Gabby's injuries? And this is point number 37 in the investigative review. He was asked, you took several pictures during this incident, most of which were of Brian and then of both of their driver's licenses. Why did you not take any pictures of Gabby's injuries? And he answered, I don't know. Again, like I said, Officer Pratt was taking the majority of the conversation with Petito, and I just made an assumption that he did that. There's also a moment where Officer Robbins approaches Officer Pratt where he's talking to Brian, and he sort of almost pushes Brian, metaphorically of course, onto Officer Robbins and says, he's in charge, tell him your story. And so you kind of have a situation where neither of the officers seem to be taking responsibility for what needs to happen. You needed one of the officers to sort of take leadership and say, I've got all the information here, this is the situation, this is where we're going, this is what is likely to happen. And instead you kind of seem to have both officers deferring to one another. Then number 38, why did you not upload the photos with the report? And that's a reference to the photos you took of Brian's injuries. Then he responds, that one to this day, I still don't know. That's kind of a very weak answer to that. Why didn't you upload the photos? Possibly because he felt like, he doesn't want to pursue the case further. He wanted to let them go, wanted to let them off the hook. 39, you don't know why they weren't uploaded? I could have sworn I did. I'm generally good about uploading pictures that I take, and for whatever reason I missed. Just seems like kind of an unacceptable response there. 40, where are the photos now? They're not on my phone. I looked for them and looked for them and looked for them. Also quite strange. He doesn't know what happened to the photos. Then if we go to page 43 of the investigative review, the conclusion, I think it says, I think this is quite worth pointing out, quote, just because Gabby was determined to be the predominant aggressor as it related to this incident doesn't mean she was the long-term predominant aggressor in this relationship. And then scrolling a bit further down, Gabby was trying to start an online career which Brian didn't support or believe she could accomplish. Brian tried locking Gabby out of the van in an attempt to control her movements. Brian said he was trying to make Gabby calm down, and Gabby said she was trying to get Brian to stop telling her to calm down. Gabby also said Brian kept telling her to shut up. Based on the information provided, I can only assume the act of Brian grabbing Gabby's face was his attempt to make Gabby calm down or make her shut up. And going a little bit further down, I find that the specific act of grabbing someone's face is extremely personal, violent, and controlling. And this fact is probably the biggest mistake they made, is not taking that part seriously. They seem to think that the injury to Brian's face and I think to his finger or something was far more serious than Brian grabbing Gabby by the face and kind of in the throat area. And then another thing stated by the officer is that Brian seemed like a mental and emotional bully. He just didn't seem like a physical, I think he means physical threat. He just didn't. And I clearly missed that huge red flag. It's kind of strange that that huge red flag was missed, because you just had a 911 call saying that Brian slapped Gabby. So he wasn't just a mental and emotional bully. He also seems to have lied about not having a phone to the officers. And then the final thing I want to mention is this is quoting again from the investigative review. Here's the real problem. We touched on this. If you're not charging somebody, you don't have authority by law to separate them. So if the officers were going to insist on separating them, they would have had to have charged someone. And it just wouldn't really have felt right if they charged Gabby, would it? At least they should have charged both of them, or we would think now Brian, right? So I'm not going to take it further than that. For those of you who are interested in the Moab incident, I've already put up 5 episodes doing a deep dive, going very, very meticulously through the footage, almost like 1 or 2 minutes at a time. And so I'm already at deep dive 5. There are many, many to come. So look out for the links in the description to Moab Deep Dive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And obviously, if you want to catch the others, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There's still quite a lot I want to deal with in the Gabby Petito case. I think a lot of people think all that there is to know has been done. I'm still finding out a lot of fascinating information. I still want to talk about the narrative behind their tattoos, and I also want to talk about Brian's reading material, particularly a book called Annihilation. And, was it the right sort of reading material to be reading for someone suffering from anxiety? And we know for a fact that Brian was reading that book during the summer epic. You see him reading it while he's sitting on his hammock. And I also want to talk about intertextualities with regard to the other book that he and Gabby had been reading, Lullaby. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you subscribe to the channel, and also let me know in the comments if that is something you'd be interested in covering, in analyzing, in researching in more detail. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.